In the summer of 1945, Japan was a nation of ashes. Its great cities had been burned from the sky, one after another, until whole districts were nothing but scorched ground and blackened chimneys standing over the dead. Its army was shattered. Its navy lay on the floor of the Pacific. Its empire, an empire that had once stretched from the plains of Manchuria to the far islands of the South Pacific, was gone. Two cities, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, had been erased in a flash of light unlike anything in human history. Japan had gambled everything on conquest, and it had lost everything. The generals who had led it into the abyss would soon face the hangman. The emperor, worshipped for centuries as a living god, would be reduced to a powerless figurehead. It was, by every appearance, the total and final destruction of an entire order.
And so you would assume that the men who had financed all of it, the small circle of family banking empires that had bankrolled Japan's rise, armed its conquests, and grown fabulously rich from its wars, were finished too. Ruined alongside the nation they had helped to build and to destroy. They were not. Within roughly a decade, those very same financial houses would be back at the commanding heights of the Japanese economy. Reorganized, renamed here and there, but unmistakably the same money and the same families, and richer, in the end, than the empire had ever made them. The same banks that had financed Japan's road to Hiroshima were back in business and thriving within 10 years of the bombs that fell on it. They have a name, these houses. In Japanese, they were called the Zaibatsu, the financial cliques. And their story is the part of Japan's war that almost no one tells.
Because the war in the Pacific is remembered as a story of fanatics, of emperor worship and suicidal generals, of kamikaze pilots and a nation gripped by a death cult of militarism. And that story is not false, but it is only the surface. Underneath the generals and the god emperor stood something older, colder, and far more durable. A financial machine, owned by a handful of families that financed the whole enterprise, profited from every conquest, and, here is the part that should stop you cold, profited even more from the defeat. This is the story of how a few family banks came to own an empire's war, and how, when that empire finally burned, the money simply walked away from the fire. Sit with the strangeness of that outcome for a moment. A nation is led into a catastrophic war. It loses. Its cities are incinerated, millions of its people are killed, its leaders are tried and executed.
And the financiers who bankrolled the entire disaster emerge, a decade later, wealthier and more powerful than they were before it began. That is not how justice is supposed to work. But it is, very often, exactly how money works. Which raises the questions this whole story exists to answer. How did a tiny handful of family-owned firms come to finance and profit from the conquests of an entire empire? Why were the men who armed Japan's war not destroyed when Japan itself was destroyed, but instead rescued and rebuilt by the very country that had just finished firebombing their factories? And what does it tell us that every visible form of power in Japan, the emperor, the military, the government, could be shattered utterly, while the financial power standing behind it survived, adapted, and won? And let me be clear about what this is, because the moment you suggest the money was the real engine of Japan's war, someone will hear it as an attempt to excuse the generals, or to invent a shadowy conspiracy running behind history's back. It is neither. The militarism was real, and the crimes were monstrous, and the men who ordered them bore the guilt for them. But the financial machinery underneath is not a theory. It is documented, mainstream history. The Zaibatsu were studied in detail by Eleanor Hadley, an American economist who examined them from inside the post-war occupation itself, and their story is laid out in acclaimed histories of occupied Japan, such as John Dower's Embracing Defeat, published in 1999. We are not guessing at how this worked. We know. If you want the hidden financial history behind the events you thought you understood, the money underneath the headlines, this is the channel built to give it to you.
So consider subscribing, and let's begin at the beginning. Because to understand how a few families came to finance an empire, you first have to go back to the moment modern Japan was born, and to the bargain that was struck, right at the very start, between the state and the money. The Japan we are talking about did not really exist before the second half of the 19th century. For more than 200 years before that, Japan had been a closed, feudal society, sealed off almost entirely from the outside world. And then, in the space of a single generation, transformed itself with a speed that has very few parallels anywhere in history. The turning point came in 1868, with the event known as the Meiji Restoration. Faced with the terrifying example of a neighboring China being carved up and humiliated by the Western powers, the very story of forced trade and gunboats we have explored before on this channel, Japan's new leaders made a fateful decision. They would not be colonized. They would do the opposite. They would industrialize, modernize, and arm themselves at breakneck speed until Japan could stand as an equal among the great powers of the earth. It was a national project of almost unimaginable ambition, and it demanded one thing above all others: capital. Enormous amounts of it. But Japan in 1868 was a poor agrarian country. It had no great pools of private capital, no established class of industrial financiers. So at first, the new government did much of the heavy lifting itself, building the first modern mines, shipyards, railways, and factories with state money. And then, in the 1880s, short of funds and eager to place these enterprises into more efficient private hands, the government sold many of them off, cheaply, and to a small, favored circle of merchants and entrepreneurs it trusted. Men who had the connections, the capital, and the loyalty to the new order to be rewarded with it. And this is the moment the Zaibatsu were truly born. A handful of families acquired, on remarkably generous terms, the industrial crown jewels of a rising nation. Some of them were already old and wealthy houses. Mitsui was a merchant dynasty that traced its money all the way back to the 17th century, to dry goods shops and money lending. Sumitomo had grown rich over centuries on copper. Others were brand new creations. Mitsubishi was the work of a single driven man, Iwasaki Yataro, who built it in the 1870s out of shipping, and who understood, from the very beginning, that the surest path to a fortune in the new Japan ran directly through the government, carrying its troops and courting its favor. Yasuda built its empire on banking. These families, and a few others like them, would come to dominate the entire economic life of modern Japan. And it is essential to understand the shape of what they built, because the shape is the whole story. A Zaibatsu was not simply a large company. It was a pyramid. At the very top sat a family holding company, privately owned, controlling everything beneath it. And directly below that, at the heart of each group, sat a bank, the group's own bank. Around that bank clustered a great trading company, reaching into every market at home and abroad. And then a sprawling web of subsidiaries: mining, shipping, steel, chemicals, textiles, insurance, whole sectors of the economy, all bound together and all financed, crucially, by that central bank. The bank was the engine. It gathered up the nation's savings and channeled them into the group's own industrial expansion. It meant that a single family, through its bank, could quietly direct a colossal share of an entire nation's capital wherever it wished it to go. By the early 20th century, these families had built the engine of a modern industrial economy, and they controlled its banking, its foreign trade, and its heavy industry to a degree that had almost no parallel anywhere else in the world. But an engine that can build an economy can also be turned to build something else. It can build an empire. And Japan, hungry for resources, hungry for status, and increasingly falling under the sway of its own military, was about to ask that engine to do exactly that. From almost the moment it modernized, Japan began to expand. And its expansion followed a logic that was, at bottom, economic. Japan was a crowded chain of islands, desperately poor in the raw materials that a modern industrial and military power devours. Poor in iron, poor in coal of the right kinds, and, most fatefully of all, almost entirely without oil. To be a true great power, Japan came to believe, it needed to control the resources and the markets that its home islands so plainly lacked. And so it reached outward, again and again, by force. It defeated China in a war in the 1890s. It stunned the entire world by defeating Imperial Russia in 1905. It annexed Korea outright in 1910. And in 1931, its army seized the vast northern Chinese region of Manchuria, rich in coal, in iron, and in farmland, and turned it into a puppet state under complete Japanese control. Each step enlarged the empire, and each step was an opportunity, an enormous commercial opportunity, for the Zaibatsu. Because who do you suppose armed these conquests? Who built the warships and the guns, forged the steel, manufactured the shells and the explosives? The Zaibatsu did. Who moved into the newly conquered territories to open the mines, run the industries, and extract the resources that the whole imperial project had been designed to seize?
The Zaibatsu trading companies and their subsidiaries did.
And who financed all of it? The industrial expansion, the war production, the government's ever-swelling military budgets? The Zaibatsu banks. The empire and the great financial houses grew up together, each one feeding the other. Conquest opened new lands to exploit. Exploitation generated profit and power. Profit and power financed the next conquest. It was, for the families at the top of the pyramids, an extraordinarily good business. But the relationship between the money and the military was not a simple, comfortable partnership, and it is important to be honest about the tension inside it. The old, established Zaibatsu, Mitsui, Mitsubishi, were by temperament cautious, commercial, and internationally minded. They wanted profit and stability. They did not necessarily want reckless, unlimited war.
And to the rising tide of radical young military officers and ultranationalists in the 1930s, that very caution made them suspect, even hated. To the fanatics, the old Zaibatsu were greedy, corrupt, insufficiently patriotic capitalists, more loyal to their profits than to the emperor. And that resentment sometimes turned violent. In 1932, in a wave of political assassinations, the head of the entire Mitsui Empire, a man named Dan Takuma, was shot dead in broad daylight by an ultranationalist assassin. The money and the military needed each other, but they did not always trust each other. And into that gap stepped a new breed of financier. Alongside the cautious old houses, a set of aggressive new conglomerates rose in the 1930s, the so-called New Zaibatsu, built explicitly around heavy industry, armaments, and the colonization of Manchuria, and far more closely aligned with the military's ambitions. One of them, the Nissan Combine, led by a bold industrialist named Aikawa, went so far as to move its very heart into Manchuria itself, to run the industrial development of Japan's new conquest hand in glove with the army. The line between the war machine and the money machine was blurring into nothing at all. Manchuria itself became a vast laboratory for this fusion of money and empire. At its center stood a colossal, semi-governmental enterprise, the South Manchuria Railway Company, which had grown far beyond mere railways into a sprawling combine that ran the coal mines, the steelworks, the harbors, and the very cities of the conquered territory. A corporation that was, in effect, the economic government of an entire colony. Around it, the new Zaibatsu poured in to build the mines and the mills that would turn Manchuria's coal and iron into the sinews of Japan's coming war. The conquest was not merely a military project. It was a business plan, executed with tanks.
By the end of the 1930s, then, Japan had become a nation in which the same small circle of hands guided both its economy and its wars. The industrial might the Zaibatsu had spent 2 generations building now stood ready and waiting, and Japan was about to hurl all of it, every ship, every factory, every last yen, into the largest and most catastrophic gamble in its entire history. In 1937, Japan plunged into all-out war with China. And then, in December of 1941, in a decision of staggering audacity, it struck the United States at Pearl Harbor and launched itself into a war across the entire Pacific, against, in effect, the single most powerful industrial nation on the face of the earth. To wage a war on that scale, Japan turned its whole economy into an engine of war, and at the center of that engine stood the Zaibatsu. Their factories now ran at full throttle, building the tools of the conflict. Mitsubishi alone was very nearly a war machine unto itself. It built warships, and it built the famous Zero fighter, the nimble, deadly aircraft that dominated the skies over the Pacific in the early years of the fighting. In its great yards at Nagasaki, Mitsubishi built some of the mightiest warships ever to put to sea, among them the colossal battleship Musashi, a floating fortress that was, in its day, one of the largest and most heavily armed warships in the entire history of the world. Across the Zaibatsu Empire, shipyards launched aircraft carriers and battleships. Steelworks poured out the metal. Chemical plants produced the explosives. The trading companies scoured the empire for the raw materials to feed it all. This was the most intense and concentrated burst of industrial activity in the family's entire history, and, for a time, one of the most profitable. And the empire that the war was meant to secure now delivered, at gunpoint, exactly what Japan's industry needed. As Japanese forces swept south through 1941 and 1942, conquering the rich European colonies of Southeast Asia, they seized the very things the home islands had always lacked: the oil of the Dutch East Indies, the rubber and tin of Malaya, the resources of a vast new empire, all now to be funneled back to feed the war machine at home. And the Zaibatsu moved in behind the soldiers to manage and to profit from this captured wealth. For one brief, intoxicating moment, the grand imperial design seemed actually to be working. Conquest was providing the resources, and the resources were fueling the fight. But there was a fatal flaw buried at the very bottom of the whole enterprise, and it was, at its root, a matter of arithmetic. The same kind of cold arithmetic that runs underneath every story we tell on this channel. Japan had gambled that it could seize its resources and win its war quickly, before the sheer industrial weight of its enemies could be brought fully to bear. It was, in the end, a bet against numbers. And against the United States, the numbers were simply overwhelming. America could build ships and planes and produce steel at a rate that Japan could not begin to match. Many times over, and then many times over again. Japan had lunged for an empire to escape its own material weakness, and in doing so, it had provoked a giant whose factories would, inevitably, bury it. The Zaibatsu had built a magnificent machine, but it had been built to fight a war that Japan could not, by the pitiless logic of production, actually win. And so, slowly at first, and then with terrible speed, the tide turned. The conquered resources could not close the gap. The ships went to the bottom faster than they could ever be replaced. And the war that had promised the Zaibatsu their single greatest fortune began, instead, to bring the fire home. To the home islands, to the cities, and to the very factories the families had spent generations building. What came next was one of the most complete acts of destruction ever visited upon a modern nation. As American forces fought their way across the Pacific and finally drew within range of the Japanese home islands, they unleashed a bombing campaign of devastating power. It began with the cities. In a single night in March of 1945, a firebombing raid on Tokyo created a firestorm so vast that it killed, by most estimates, around 100,000 people in a matter of hours, and left much of the capital a burned-out wasteland. City after city followed, reduced one by one to ash. And the industrial base that the Zaibatsu had built, the shipyards, the steelworks, the great factories, was a central and deliberate target, methodically pounded into ruin. The very heart of the family's industrial empire was being systematically destroyed from the air. And then came the two events that would end the war and define the century that followed. In August of 1945, an atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, and 3 days later, another on Nagasaki. And there is a grim and rarely noted irony in the second of those cities. Nagasaki was, in significant part, a Mitsubishi town, the home of vast Mitsubishi shipyards and arms works that had helped to build Japan's war. The bomb that fell there fell squarely on the kind of industrial heart the Zaibatsu had spent decades constructing. The machine of conquest and the people who lived and worked beside it were consumed together in an instant
by the ultimate expression of the very industrial power that Japan had gambled it could match, and could not. Days later, Japan surrendered. The war was over. And the reckoning that arrived with the peace seemed, at first, as though it would be total. A foreign army, the Americans, now occupied Japan for the first time in its long history. And the occupiers arrived with a firm and clear conviction about who had made this war possible.
They believed that the Zaibatsu, the great financial and industrial combines, had been essential enablers of Japanese militarism. That the sheer concentration of so much economic power in so few hands had helped to drive the entire nation toward aggression and war. And they were determined to break them for good. For the family houses that had ridden Japan's empire all the way to the heights of wealth, this was the moment of maximum danger. Their factories were rubble. Their empire was gone. And now the conquerors were coming for the families themselves, resolved to destroy their power forever. By every reasonable expectation, this should have been the end of the Zaibatsu. It was not. Because history was about to intervene on their behalf, in the form of a new and very different war. In the first months of the occupation, the American authorities moved decisively to dismantle the Zaibatsu. It was one of the great goals of the early occupation, to democratize Japan not only in its politics, but in its economy, by breaking apart the enormous concentrations of private power that were believed to have helped feed its militarism. So the orders came down. The family holding companies at the very top of the pyramids, the precise instruments of family control, were to be dissolved. A commission was established to liquidate them, to seize the families controlling shares and disperse them widely. New laws were drafted to outlaw the very kind of monopoly power the Zaibatsu had wielded. Leading executives were purged from their positions. The founding families were to be stripped of their command over the commanding heights of the economy. On paper, it was a sweeping and radical demolition of the entire old financial order. And then, the world changed. As the 1940s drew to a close, the alliance that had won the Second World War collapsed into a new and colder confrontation. The Cold War, between the United States and the Soviet Union. And in Asia, the ground shifted with terrifying speed. In 1949, the most populous nation on Earth, China, fell to a communist revolution. In 1950, war erupted in Korea, right on Japan's doorstep, pitting the American-led world directly against communist forces. Almost overnight, the strategic value of Japan to the United States was utterly transformed. Japan was no longer merely a defeated enemy to be reformed and punished. It was now a crucial potential ally, a bulwark against communism in Asia, an industrial power that the West suddenly, urgently needed to be stable, prosperous, and firmly on its own side. And that transformed everything for the Zaibatsu. The priority was no longer to break up Japanese industry. It was to rebuild it, and to rebuild it fast. The aggressive program of deconcentration was quietly scaled back, and then very largely abandoned. Of the many great firms that had been formally marked for breakup, only a small fraction were ever actually split apart at all. And even the breakups that did happen often proved to be temporary. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, the great shipbuilding and arms giant at the very heart of the Mitsubishi Group, was indeed carved up, divided into 3 separate regional companies. But the division did not last. In 1964, once the danger had passed and the mood of the times had changed, the 3 pieces were quietly allowed to merge back together into a single Mitsubishi Heavy Industries once again, almost as though the breakup had never happened at all. The purges of business leaders were relaxed, and many of them returned to power. The families did lose their old holding companies, and their direct, formal ownership of the pyramids was gone for good. But the industrial groups themselves, the deep networks of allied companies, and the great banks at their center, survived very largely intact. The punishment had been called off. The Americans had decided, in the end, that they needed the Zaibatsu machine far more than they needed to destroy it. And then came the windfall, the stroke of fortune that would launch the old houses into an entirely new golden age.
The war in Korea, raging just across the sea, needed to be supplied, and the United States turned to Japanese industry to supply it. A flood of American military orders for trucks, for equipment, for war material of every kind came pouring into Japan's factories and jump-started the shattered economy back to roaring life. The same industrial groups that had armed Japan's own war were now being paid, and paid handsomely, to help arm America's. It was the beginning of a resurrection. Out of the ashes, the great financial groups reassembled themselves, in a new form, adapted to the new rules, but unmistakably the same old money. Since the family holding companies were now banned, the groups reorganized around the one institution that had always been at their very core: the bank. In place of the old, top-down pyramids came looser but still powerful new networks, clusters of allied companies bound together by the cross-ownership of one another's shares, and, at the center of each cluster, a great main bank that financed them all and tied them into a single coordinated group. The Japanese called these new groupings keiretsu, but the names on them were the old familiar names: Mitsubishi, Mitsui, Sumitomo. The family's formal ownership had gone, but the groups endured, and the banks at their heart were now more central than ever. The coordination did not even require formal ownership any longer. The heads of the major companies in each group took to meeting regularly and quietly in what came to be known as presidents' clubs. Informal councils where the leaders of a Mitsubishi or a Sumitomo could align their strategy, steer their investment, and act, when it truly mattered, as a single coordinated block. The old pyramid had been outlawed. The network that quietly replaced it was, in some ways, even harder to see. In effect, the old houses had been forced to convert themselves from family empires into bank-centered networks. And in doing so, they had survived. And then they did far more than merely survive. Through the 1950s and 1960s, these groups became the engine of one of the most astonishing economic transformations in all of history: the Japanese economic miracle, which lifted a burned and defeated nation into the front ranks of the wealthiest on earth in a single generation. The great banks financed it. The great trading companies drove the exports across the world. And the industrial firms, many of them bearing the very same names that had once built the battleships and the fighter planes, now built the cars and the ships and the electronics that would conquer the markets of the entire planet. Within a decade of total defeat, the old financial houses were not merely back. They were richer and in many ways more powerful than the empire had ever managed to make them. So let us return, at last, to where we began, and to the truth this whole story reveals. We remember Japan's war as the story of the generals and the god emperor, of militarism and of its total and crushing defeat. And that story is true as far as it goes, but it misses the deepest current running beneath the surface. Because look at what actually survived. The military that led Japan into ruin was disbanded and disgraced. The emperor who had reigned over it all was stripped of his divinity and reduced to a mere symbol. The empire itself was dismantled and gone forever. Every visible form of Japanese power was shattered by the war. But the money survived. The families that had financed the entire catastrophe did not merely live through it. They emerged, within a single decade, standing at the very top of the new Japan. The generals were hanged, the emperor was humbled, and the bankers were rebuilt. And that points to a truth about power that this channel returns to again and again. A truth that is easy to miss precisely because it is so rarely spoken aloud. Political power is fragile. Regimes fall, armies are defeated, emperors are dethroned, ideologies burn themselves out. But financial power is the most durable form of power there is. And the reason is almost mechanical. Whoever wins a war, whoever ends up ruling the peace, still needs an economy that functions, still needs banks to lend and factories to produce and trade to flow. And so the financiers, the men who make the economy actually work, are almost never destroyed for long. They are simply too useful, even to their own conquerors.
even after they have helped to author a catastrophe. The war that destroyed Japan killed millions and toppled an empire. But for the small circle of men who had financed it, it turned out, in the end, to be the single greatest deal of all. And if you think all of this belongs safely to the past, to a defeated empire and a long-vanished war, then consider where those very same names sit today. The great houses did not fade away. They stand, right now, among the largest and most powerful commercial enterprises on the entire planet. The names Mitsubishi, Mitsui, and Sumitomo still command sprawling global groups. The banks at their heart have grown into some of the biggest financial institutions in the world. And here is a single telling detail. A few years ago, one of the most celebrated investors alive, Warren Buffett, poured billions of dollars into the 5 great Japanese trading houses, the very trading companies at the core of the old Zaibatsu system, betting, in effect, that these institutions born of empire are now among the safest blue-chip pillars of global capitalism. The money that once financed Japan's war is not some historical footnote. It is a cornerstone of the modern world economy. And the pattern it reveals is not unique to Japan at all. You can watch it repeat in our own time. When the global financial system very nearly collapsed in 2008, brought down in large part by the recklessness of the great banks themselves, those same banks were not destroyed for it. They were rescued, bailed out with the public's money, judged simply too important to be allowed to fail. And they emerged from the wreckage larger than they had been before. It is the Zaibatsu lesson, played again. Financial power, having helped to cause a catastrophe, is rebuilt by the very authorities it damaged, because those authorities cannot run a modern economy without it. And there is a final turn, unfolding right now, that closes the circle almost too perfectly. Today, facing a rising and assertive China, Japan is embarking on its largest military buildup since the Second World War, approving record defense budgets year after year, the biggest in its post-war history, and racing to rearm itself as it has not done since 1945. And who is building the missiles, and the warships, and the next generation of Japan's weapons? Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, the prime contractor sitting at the very heart of Japan's rearmament, and the direct corporate descendant of the same Mitsubishi that built the Zero fighter and the warships of the Imperial Fleet. The firm that armed Japan's empire is arming Japan once again. The wheel has turned full circle. And the money, as it always is sitting exactly where the power is. Armies can be defeated, and emperors dethroned, and whole empires burned down to ash. But money has a quiet way of surviving the very fires it helps to start, and of being rebuilt every single time by whoever is left standing at the end to count what remains.